Luís Graça is a pianist and content creator who created a video of his 2.5 years piano progress. Within those 2.5 years, he was entirely self-taught and did 2,000 hours of practice, which is a lot. Now, long after he made this video, I hope he doesn't mind me saying, but he did come to me for help with working on a piece. So I'm super interested to see what his first 2.5 years of progress look like. So let's get into it. Now, interestingly, I think Luís, like many other people who start self-taught, is neglecting the reading part of playing. And while I do think you've got to balance kind of pieces that you want to do and that you're going to really enjoy with pieces that are going to help you learn the most, I think there are a lot of pieces that are super easy and super readable for a beginner. And this particular piece has kind of a weird rhythm with your right hand against the left hand. So I would say this is probably a month 2, 3, 4 type of piece, because you probably want to start with reading and getting used to like conventional note lengths before you start adding odd rhythms in. And that way you can focus on technique and being really in control of your hands. But I get that you've got to balance pieces that you want to do with pieces that are optimal. So this piece is actually probably a lot better than the other piece, because the only thing that you really need to know in order to play this piece, other than obviously technically being able to play the piece, is that you're playing in groups of threes. Once you understand that, then the rest of the piece is just about actually physically playing it. I think with a lot of nowadays music as well, there's a lot of character that you can add into the music because they're all quite soft and sensitive pieces. Yeah, this is a common thing where people's goal is to learn as many pieces as they can, as quickly as they can, and not worry about technique. A lot of words in music, like technique and music theory and things like that, have got a bad reputation. All technique is how you play something, and all music theory is understanding what you're playing. And all having good technique means is that you can approach something and your hands will be able to learn how to play it more quickly, because you've trained your fingers to be more independent and play more demanding things. No matter how you learn to play an instrument, you are going to be learning some technique and some music theory. The only difference is what you call it and whether you deliberately practice those things. And I would say it's obviously wise to practice your technique and your understanding of music, because then that will help when you approach future pieces of music. I definitely feel his pain there. There's been many a times when I've done loads and loads of recordings to try and get one full take of a piece. That's very strange, it looks like a floating pair of hands. With this piece, it almost feels like his hands are slipping out of coordination. With pieces where it sounds like you have two separate things going on in two different hands, often it's better to think vertically rather than horizontally. So with this, it's tempting to think of the right hand as one thing that's continually moving. But instead of you think of both hands as one thing that's happening at the same time, then you can think of it as a series of either right hand, left hand, or hands together. And then that way you can train in the coordination between your hands. For those that are starting to learn the piano, they often think that it's about multitasking and getting two hands to do different things at the same time. But it actually isn't. And I am terrible at multitasking, so if it was about multitasking, then I wouldn't be able to play the piano. It's actually just a series of things that are either the right hand, the left hand, or hands together. And if you think of it vertically like that, then your hands will work together rather than against each other. The The one thing I will say that his melody is really nice and clear, and that's quite a hard thing to do. It's very easy to end up drowning the melody out with your left hand, which is what a lot of people do when they first start in, because it's hard to control each finger playing different volumes. And that is probably one of the biggest things that makes the piano so difficult, is trying to balance the volume in each individual finger. Yeah, interesting. So here in the left hand, he's using the same pattern for each of these chord shapes. But if you are starting on a white note, then I would definitely use fingers 5, 2, 1, 2, like he has been doing. But when you start on a black note, it's probably better to do 5, 3, 2, 1, rather than 5, 2, 1, and then stretch your hand over unnaturally. It does require for those black notes a bit of wrist movement to get your hand over, but once again, that's good technique practice, because in order to stay relaxed and get rid of tension in your hands and wrists, you have to be able to move your wrists. So interestingly, Moonlight Sonata Movement 1 is in something called cut time, and that means it's got a time signature of 2-2, which means you're counting 2 sets of 2 beats in a bar. So in actual fact, you want the pulse to feel like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that you have more of a stress on beat 1 and 3 because you're counting 2 sets of 2 beats. And once again, this is something that a lot of players do, where you end up stressing each of the beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. But by doing that, the music doesn't float quite so much, and it needs to feel like it's almost rolling forward. Especially as you've got that kind of rotating 3-note pattern that feels like it's rolling. Nice, yeah, he plays this very nicely, and he's using the right fingers in the left hand, which a lot of people don't. Yeah, it's hard to tell with Erik Satie whether his pieces are depressing or relaxed. I think it depends what mood you're in when you're listening to it as to how it comes across. But also, Satie wrote a lot of kind of joke pieces, like his Sports et Divertissements. I'm absolutely butchering the pronunciation, and I've just had to say it about 6 times before the one that you've just heard. His Sports et Divertissements. But yeah, he was quite an unusual composer because he has these kind of really relaxed, sensitive French pieces, but then he has a lot of pieces that are in stark contrast to that. The first piece that he learnt with sheet music, which means all of the pieces so far he hasn't learnt with sheet music, which means I assume he's learnt them through YouTube. Realistically, if he had learnt all of the pieces so far using sheet music, it might have added an extra 1 to 2 months of learning onto what he's already done. But at the same time, now he would be much quicker at reading harder pieces. So in the long term, it would have saved him a lot of time, and he would have been able to see so much more detail in the music and make decisions about what's happening. Yeah, when your fingers bend like that on the key, it's often because your fingers are either too straight when you press a key, or it's because you are pressing too hard on the key unnecessarily, which means your finger then bends. The best way to practice this is to practice scales, because you can really focus on being on the tips of your fingers when you practice scales, especially scales like B major, which uses all the black keys, so it fits quite nicely under the hand because it fits your hand shape. Then when you go to practice a piece of music, if you practice scales quite a lot, then you will naturally be on the tips of your fingers, and your fingers won't be able to bend so easily. Yeah, I can see, especially in his right hand there, his fingers are quite flat on the keys. So if this happens, you just need to move your hand further forward and lift your hand up so that your fingers have to bend. This looks like the piano that's in St Pancras Station in London. It's a very popular destination for pianists. Yeah, so the pedalling is often another thing that is difficult for beginners to learn by themselves because they don't know when they're supposed to use the piano pedals. But the general rule for when you are supposed to put down and lift up the pedal is when the chords change. So if you are playing something that is based around one particular chord, then you can hold the sustain pedal down throughout that entire chord. But then when the chord changes, you want to lift the pedal up and put it straight back down again. You've just got to make sure that you don't lift the pedal up until you've actually played the first note of the next chord. Because if you lift the pedal up to put it down at the same time as your hands, then you'll leave a little bit of a gap. So you've got to play the first note of the next chord and then lift your foot up and put it down again. So that piece is obviously by far way too difficult for this stage of learning. This is where practicing certain techniques comes into practice, because this piece uses a lot of broken chords. So for example, if I play a C major chord with another C on top of it, so I've got the notes C, E, G and C, if I play each of these notes independently, and then start on the second note of that chord and do the same again, so this time E, G, C, E, and then the same again, G, C, E, G, and then the same again, C, E, G, C, all the way up the piano, this is called a broken chord. And this is the exact technique that this piece of music is using. So if you've already practiced this technique before you come to approach this piece, then it's going to be 10 times easier to learn. But if you're learning this piece having never practiced broken chords before, and maybe not even understanding how chords work in music, so you end up trying to learn each of the individual notes and then force it into your hand, it can just cause a lot of tension in your hands, which is hard to undo later on. Once again, I'd be interested to know if he's learnt this piece by reading the sheet music, because there's a lot of unusual things in the sheet music that take a lot to understand. His hands seem nice and relaxed now, which is very good. It's interesting because in his right hand, it looks like his wrist is kind of locked in one place. With this melody in particular, there's a lot of sort of bounciness about it. It feels kind of fiery, especially with that left hand bubbling underneath. And in order for it to sound fiery and bouncy, your right hand needs to be really relaxed. So when practicing this, it's worth stopping on some of the notes and just making sure your wrist is really loose. That way you can sort of train in moments into the piece where your wrist will unlock. And you can also focus on the character of that melody and how you want it to sound. Another piece that is probably better off learned after 4 or 5 years when you've really drilled in some of those techniques, and there's thousands of pieces that are a lot easier that are just as good, probably millions of pieces. I know everyone wants to learn the classics, especially because they sound so impressive, but there are lots of pieces that sound fast and impressive that are more conventional in terms of scales and patterns that they use, so they're better for building your kind of base technique before you start doing the more unusual patterns and techniques that can layer on top of that. See, the left hand is more conventional in terms of the chord pattern and the shapes that it's using, and he plays it very, very well. A chromatic scale is actually a really handy scale to know. And it has a very particular set of fingers, so when you have 2 white notes together, then it's fingers 1 and 2. But if you get white to black, then it's fingers 1 and 3. So on the way up, it would be 1 3 1 3 1 2 3 1 3 1 3 1 2. Chromatic scales do come up quite a lot, and they can also sound quite flashy if you can play it quite fast. So interestingly, in his right hand, I'm kind of hearing his hand kind of fall through those notes on the way up, which is telling me that he doesn't quite have the independence of his fingers yet. And this particular section is quite arpeggio based, so you've kind of got a chord shape that's being played. And to gain independence of your fingers over shapes like that, it would help to do something like arpeggios, where you play a chord and split it across the piano like that. Also, in this particular section, you've got polyrhythms to deal with, which means in the right hand, you're kind of playing groups of 4. But in the left hand, you're playing groups of 3. So you've got to try and fit those together, and the best way to do that is to try and concentrate on where they come together, which is here. That way, each of the notes in the right hand and each of the notes in the left hand will be perfectly even. So when you speed it up, your hands are relaxed and you can play it all nice and evenly. Yeah, nice. He's actually done a pretty good job with that. He's obviously committed to it. And this is why I do think it's somewhat important to balance the learn pieces that you're motivated to practice and learn pieces that are optimal for progress. Because while he definitely would have learned more about chords, pedaling, technique by learning other pieces, ultimately the whole point of learning the piano is to play pieces that you're going to enjoy. So if you are motivated to commit to something that's that difficult, then it will help you technically be able to play the piano much better. You're just not going to have the same understanding of the music that you would have had if you'd learnt it later. Yeah, so that's actually not a trill. A trill is where you play 2 notes quickly. Also, I don't know about you, but that candle that is sitting on the piano is putting me on edge. I've got to say, though, that he does play very, very musically, and he obviously has an understanding of how the music is supposed to feel. And this is the good thing about being self-taught and being able to choose your own pieces of music. Because the reason that you choose a piece of music is because you like it and understand it. So being able to play it, you're much more likely to understand it musically. All 4 Chopin ballades are once again very difficult, and they're all well above grade A. He definitely has a taste for difficult pieces. But once again, I think it would have served him better to learn more technically simple pieces, but more musically difficult pieces. So things that require understanding the music, rather than just going for things that are going to physically be challenging, but you're never going to understand. You see, this is perfect because now he's having to understand how music is made and what chords are, how the chords feel in order to compose his own music. So this is perfect for him. So he's gravitating towards that same pattern where you are playing sort of a normal chord, but you're taking out the middle note, adding an octave, so the same note as the bottom, and playing that middle note on top instead. This is the same pattern that was used in one of the Einaudi pieces earlier, and it's a very, very popular pattern to outline chords in the left hand on the piano. So here he definitely seems much more in control of his hands, and his hands look much more relaxed than they did when he first started learning this piece. And I think that obviously comes from practicing this specific piece, but also from practicing all of the other pieces. His hands have naturally become more accustomed to the types of shapes he needs in order to play these broken chords. Yeah, it's super interesting because sometimes you do come across these pieces where you are super motivated to learn it, or you've learned enough of it that it becomes a lot easier to learn the rest of it. I think when you get to these kind of pieces which are slightly longer and there's a lot more technical demands in it, you really have to commit to the piece for some time. And a lot of the time that's quite hard to do if you aren't preparing it for something like a concert or an exam or something like that. But occasionally you start to see enough progress with a piece that you almost have to finish it. And obviously for Luís, this is one of those pieces. He actually writes really nice music. It's definitely in that Einaudi film Hans Zimmer-y kind of landscape. And I think Luís also gravitates towards those kind of black note keys, so like G flat major, B flat minor, things like that. And I think Einaudi does as well. So Chopin wrote 2 sets of etudes, the Opus 10 and the Opus 25, and all of the etudes are quite difficult. And an etude is like a piece that's used for studying. So each of the etudes kind of focuses on a particular technique, and they're all very, very difficult. For the most part, most of them are more technically challenging, but there are a few in there that are very musically challenging as well. I think you shouldn't learn by brute force, but I think there's a difference between drilling in something into your playing and playing by brute force. I think brute force is where you're trying to immediately perform the piece and you're trying to hammer it in and tensing your hands to do that, whereas learning it methodically and repeating it lots of times isn't really brute force. That's kind of how you have to learn these types of pieces. What I would say though is it's probably better to slow it down and use a metronome in order to be really consistent and make sure your hand is doing exactly what you want it to do. And there you go, he's using a metronome, so there's no brute force going on at all. So here he said he's focusing on the notes rather than the dynamics. What I would say is practice in much smaller sections. So a bar, 2 bars, 4 bars at a time. And practice both the technique and the character of the piece, because you can do both at the same time. And if you drill it into your hands, playing it without dynamics and character and things like that, then you will always play it like that. So now, technically, he is a great player. I mean, these pieces are far within his range in terms of technical ability. But once again, I do wonder to what extent he's using the music, analysing the music, making choices based on what's on the page, and how much he theoretically understands how the music has been written, and therefore how to play it. I do think it's great that he's written his own music. I think that is a massive learning curve, and it will do a lot to help his musical theory understanding, because you're having to work out chords in order to find which sounds you like, and then you remember them because you like the sound of them. And people who are always great with their ears or great at understanding music are always the people who just sit and mess around on the piano and make stuff up. So writing music really does help your understanding of what sounds work well together and why. Yeah, I'm not sure why he hasn't done Interstellar earlier either. I think Interstellar is one of those pieces that he should have done early on compared to some of the ones that he did do. he has done a really great job at learning some of these more difficult pieces. And technically speaking, despite the fact that he did brute force some of the pieces early on, he has really relaxed his hands and become technically very, very good at the piano. My question at this stage, though, would be 1, around his music reading, and 2, around his understanding of the music. I suppose it depends what you value out of learning music, but for me, understanding music and why music is written the way it is, what emotional effect it has and why it has that effect, is probably the most important thing about music. Learning to be very technical on the piano is a byproduct of expressing something, but I think it's important to understand what you're expressing, particularly with classical music, because it's all about storytelling. And it's interesting that at the beginning of this video, he said that he didn't really get classical music, and I think that's because unlike film music and pop music, where the meaning is kind of explicitly given to you, in a film, what it's expressing is shown on screen, and in pop music, you get lyrics, which tell you what the song is about. In classical music, you have to interpret the meaning of the piece, and they're often a lot longer and a lot more complex in what they're expressing. But I think this video goes to show that being self-taught doesn't need to be a barrier for someone learning the piano. And Luís is definitely a great player and plays very, very well. If you want to see my reaction to a 1-year piano progress video, then head on through and I will see you there.